Hi guys, today we are going to talk about AWS Lambda. Basically, Lambda functions are one of the key and then the core services that you use often as a cloud engineer. AWS Lambda is just a serverless service, right? A serverless compute service that runs your code and then it only runs when you triggers it. So Lambda pretty much allows you to run your logics without necessarily having to have a server running each time. Hence the concept of serverless, right? So you don't have servers running each time. It works only when you want it to work, and then you pay for only the time it kind of works. So it's very key and then very common service that you work with. So I'll just jump right into it. Just log into AWS and then look for Lambda. And then if it's your first time, you will see Lambda. Just click on functions and then we are going to create our first function. So there are ways through which you can create your Lambda functions. The most common and the most popular one that you're going to use is author from scratch. That is what you're going to do for this tutorial. And then I'm going to just give my function a name. So I'm going to call my function contact form processor. And then I'll choose a runtime. So a runtime is basically the language in which you are going to write your function. Remember, the Lambda is just a service that allows you to write your code to perform a particular function or a particular activity. So Lambda has certain languages that it supports, so you can just go through it. For this tutorial, I'm going to use Python, so I'm going to select Python 3.13, and then I'll leave everything as default for now. Permissions, I will allow the Lambda to create a default permission for me, which I can make use of. So I'll basically click on create function. Now, this is our Lambda function. One of the key things I just want you guys to know is, as I said, Lambda does not run always. Lambda is not working on a server. So Lambda function pretty much work when you want it to work. So that's why we have this trigger here. So if say you have an event-driven solution where you want to perform a specific activity with your Lambda function when a certain situation occurs, you can add triggers to it. That is, you can connect it with other service. So one of the common example that you often hear is, say someone uploads something into S3 buckets and then you want to read from it and write it into a DB table. What you can do is you can set up a trigger, an S3 trigger with your Lambda function. So each time something comes into a S3 bucket, it gets written into your DynamoDB table. All those functions and stuff can be in here. So that's one key thing I want you to know. Now, this is the Lambda interface where you write your Python code. So in here, you can see a couple of things. The first thing you see in here is we are kind of importing JSON, right, as part of the default boilerplate that we see. But I want you guys to see these two things. Events pretty much tells you, it kind of contains all the input data, right? All the input data. What is coming in to trigger your Lambda function? It comes in as part of your event. And then context pretty much provides the runtime information, right? The execution time and things like that. That works in your Lambda function. The very crucial bit of each Lambda function, you can have a Lambda function that has a lot of things in them, but what gets first triggered is your Lambda Handler, right? So this is your key function, that is, or your key method that gets invoked each time you call your Lambda function. So all other stuff will come in from there. So it's pretty much like your entry function each time your Lambda function executes. So that is the Lambda interface on a high level. Yeah, to run your Lambda function, you always have to deploy your Lambda function. So for example, if I want to run this Lambda function, all I can do is probably create a test event and then run it. But before my Lambda function can work fine, I'll have to ensure that I've deployed it. So I'm quickly going to test to show you guys what this will happen. So I'm just going to create a test event. Say test event, and then I will leave it with the default parameters and we will see the results. Remember, as I said, when you're invoking a Lambda function, there is an event coming in, right? There is a data coming in. That is your event. That's your input. So I'm just going to save this and then invoke my Lambda function. And I'll show you guys something. So clearly, my Lambda function has been invoked, the state event name, and then the response. So this is pretty much a simple Lambda function. So I'm just going to modify the Lambda code to show you guys something. I'm going to add a print statement, and then I want to just print my events. What is triggering my Lambda function? What is in there? Always remember, each time you modify your Lambda function, if you want it to work, you will have to deploy your Lambda function. So I will click on deploy. And now, after deploying my Lambda function, I can just proceed to invoke it again using the same test event. I want you guys to see. So now, this is my Lambda function. And then looking at the function logs, there is this event. What was in there? This is the Lambda function. So now looking at the events, we can see what I passed. So if I come into the event, you see these are the events that was kind of invoking my Lambda function. So this is a very simple overview of what the Lambda function does. Now, I want to quickly show you guys some of the key things you have to note with regards to your Lambda function. So on the configuration tab, we have general information. Remember, as I said, Lambda function pretty much works when you want it to work. And then Lambda function has something we call timeout. Timeout pretty much tells you the number of minutes or seconds that you want your Lambda function to run on each invocation. The memory indicates the memory allocation you are giving to your Lambda function, and then the storage that you are giving to your Lambda function. If you want your Lambda function, say you have a massive Lambda function that is running a heavy load and then you want huge memory allocation, you can do that. Yeah. If you want to modify your timeout, you can always increase it. So I can probably increase my timeout to 3 minutes and then I'll save it. So this is one key thing with Lambda function. Another thing I want you guys to note is permissions. As I said, everything on AWS is pretty much permission bound. It's either you are allowing to do it or you are denying yourself from doing it. And once you create your Lambda function, you can always come in here to modify and then adjust your permissions depending on what you want to do. Yeah, if you guys want to understand how permissions work, I have a simple video on IAM rules and things like that. You can check it out and that will give you a proper understanding and overview. Yeah. Now, another thing I want you guys to quickly notice, environment variables. Environment variables is very key in programming because, especially when you are working across environments where you have certain delegate values that you don't want to be part of your code, you want to store them securely or you want to store them so that, say you copy your code and you share your code, you don't want to release certain secrets. You can store all those things as environment variables and then you can set that up here. Now you can have your Lambda in a VPC. That is, if you want your Lambda to be secure on a private network and all that, all those connections are there, but that is a bit advanced. We have this called Lambda functions URL. Lambda functions URL too is a bit advanced, but pretty much what it does, it exposes an API endpoint for you that allows HTTP endpoint that allows you to use your Lambda functions, access your Lambda functions as you are accessing APIs. So that is something that you can do. And then Lambda function works seamlessly with CloudWatch Logs. So you can monitor your Lambda logs just by coming to monitor and then clicking here. Lambda logs are being stored, right, in CloudWatch, and then each time you invoke your Lambda, there is an execution. So from the test that I did, if I come in here, you'll be able to see the events and everything. So that is it. So this is very good when it comes to debugging your Lambda functions. So on a high level, these are some of the key things that you have to note when it comes to Lambda function. Always ensure your Lambda has the right and appropriate permissions. Always ensure that if you are environment variables, you are setting them correctly, and then just play with it. So this is Lambda functions on a high level. I'm just going to quickly run a simple function I have that's for us to see exactly a very simple use case or a very simple scenario. I'll do well to share this Lambda code with you guys. So this is a very simple Lambda function that I have in here. So in my code, this part, as I said, I'm doing some random imports. I'm importing Boto3. I'm importing datetime. This is our regular Python stuff. Yeah. So JSON just for handling my JSON stuff. Boto3 to access some AWS services and do some few other stuff. We have datetime for that also. And then that's pretty much it. As I said, the key component of every Lambda function is always your Lambda handler. So if you come into my Lambda handler, I'm trying to get name, I'm getting email, message as part of the event that is going to trigger this Lambda function. Remember, I said the Lambda function is pretty much being triggered by input, which is part of the event. So I'm saying that the event that I will send to invoke this Lambda function, I'm going to have name in there, I'm going to have email, and then I'll proceed to return this message. So this is just a very simple Lambda function. You can always play with whatever Lambda function logic you have. And then that's it. So I have a dummy event that contains all this. I'll just come into my test. And then let me paste my event in here. So as I said, so if you look at, so this is the event that I'm invoking my Lambda function with. I'm saying inside my event, I have a body. There is name John Doe. There is this email. And then that is it. So I'm just going to save it. And then I'll test my Lambda function. So this is my Lambda function. Guys, see something. You see, I said, before you invoke your Lambda function, or if you want your Lambda function to work, you always have to deploy it. Because I did not kind of deploy it, look at what is coming in. It's returning the old response, right? But because I've saved the events, and then now the old Lambda was invoked using a different event. Look at the events body. So I'm just going to deploy my Lambda function. And then I'm going to test my Lambda again. And now look at my response. Thank you, John Doe. We have received your message, and then it was a success. So that's pretty much it. So it's going in there, picking the details as part of from my event, and then it's giving me this message. If I go to CloudWatch Log and then I refresh, you'll see the log stream, right? So this is the log stream for the current test that I did. New contact submission for John Doe. This is so guys, this is a high level Lambda function, and what is that? It works when you want to work with it and all. Please, if you want more, I have a lot of tutorials that I use Lambda function to perform some deeper logic. Kindly do well to check them out. And then let's meet in the next video.